This is the D6 generation.
Dice are our vice.
Creating not too horrible content since 2008.
Are you crazy? That's like 400 hours of gamer nonsense.
Oh, I think we're well past that. Hey, welcome back to another episode of the D6 generation, and we are very excited, Raef.
Super excited.
This is a 3-pip.
Yes, that's right.
Because not only is Raef here with me, and I'm here, but now we are super excited to have Matt Wilson from Privateer Press back in the virtual studio.
Yep.
Live on Zoom. And Matt, welcome to the show. Can you believe this is your 6th appearance on the D6 generation? What is that about?
I can't even believe that it's been 6 times, but at my age now, my memory is failing. So I can't remember what happened last week.
It's getting, the fun part, we've been talking, Matt's very first appearance in the D6 generation was all the way back in 2008. If you can believe it.
I can't believe it.
Episode 14. Matt was kind enough. We're this little up and coming podcast, knowing who we were. And Matt was kind enough. I think you cornered him at Gen Con.
Yep,
we're like, Matt, would you come on our show? And he was like, so kind to come on. So Matt, thank you for sticking with us all this time. We can't wait to, and by the way, if you're a listener out there and you're like, hey, I want to hear like Matt's origin story and how he started Privateer Press and all, that's back in episode 14. We talked about all that then.
Yep.
It's still on the internet. Go check it out on our feed. You can listen all about that. But we want to talk today with Mr. Wilson about the awesomeness that is Warmachine 4th edition.
Yes.
Matt, we blame you. We've been completely sucked back into your crazy game since 4th edition. So that's your fault.
All right. Mission accomplished then.
I feel like it. But Raef, I know you had a question you want to kick us off today with. Go ahead.
Yeah. So Matt knows, we sometimes stay in touch for years past, but Russ and I are just giant fanboys of Privateer Press. We always have been, and big fans of you, Matt. And I remember there was a period of time, I don't remember how long ago, but you had stepped away from the helm of Privateer Press, maybe the direct helm, and you were pursuing some other pursuits. And then I was just curious with Mk4, and that I read that letter, the creative director letter that you, or email that you wrote. It was a letter posted. It was really great to see you back, and that really helped explain a lot. And I was like, oh, does this mean Matt's more back at the helm, or does he have a different role with his own company? And so that was my question.
Yeah, there was a time there where we had a lot of different people. We had experienced a lot of growth. And I was looking to take, Privateer's properties, Warmachine and Monster Apocalypse, into other directions. And as well, I was exploring, and still am, doing a lot of work in film and other mediums. So Privateer has always been my core focus. Excuse me, even during those times when I wasn't quite as hands-on with everything as I am right now. But I've also always had, a lot of other things that I've followed up on, whether it was illustration work or writing, screenwriting, filmmaking. We've had video game projects in the works and all kinds of different things that I've sort of got my hands in. Some things that people know about, some things that they don't know about, some things that people will never know about. And but I would say that, now, particularly with 4th edition, I'm much more involved in the day-to-day operations and hands-on than I was, say, 6 or 8 years ago. And I don't want to give the impression that I was ever not part of Privateer. Like I said, it was always my mainstay. It has been since 23, 24 years ago when we started it. But at this point, yeah, we've got a smaller, leaner team now, and so it kind of is a situation where everybody's doing a lot of different things, and it kind of has more of the feel of when we started, where it's a little scrappier and it's a little exploratory and experimental and trying new things, and really, having fun with it rather than it being sort of something that's kind of templated and you know where you're going year after year. Now it's kind of it's fun again to be in this super creative space where every day we're, tackling a new problem, or we're coming up with a new idea, or, just really trying to sort of keep having fun with something that we've been doing for 20 years.
I can't believe it's even been that long. And yeah, that's a good point. I think I gave the impression that you stepped away. I more meant in my love, which was the miniature game portion of it. So thanks for clarifying that for our listeners. I think I'm hearing, since you and I last chatted, Matt, I'm now 100% do business coaching. I teach entrepreneurs, and I'm kind of hearing that like, ooh, the entrepreneurialism of the company is back. And it sounds like you're excited about that. And I know Russ has a bunch of questions along that front. So that's really exciting to hear.
I might need to sign up for your course.
I'd love to have you.
Well, Matt,
we'll chat.
It's obvious.
The longer I go, the less equipped I feel I am for this job. So
that just means more.
That's right.
See, that's the
It's
thing.
wisdom.
I think I found as I get older, I know how much less I know, because I know how much more there is to know. I guess I don't even know how that works.
Good point.
But Matt, you said something in there, and I don't ever want to imply that Privateer wasn't cranking out great products, because I've been with you guys for all the years, and you have. But it definitely feels like with Fourth Edition, there's a passion, there's an excitement, there's an energy that's back. And let me ask you this, because obviously you guys were super excited about Fourth. There's obviously a crap ton of thought that went into this, because I think a lot of people in my day job, I'm not a coach like Raef is, but I'm a product manager. So I understand you launch small and you build and you learn as you go. And even though that sounds simple, there's a lot of planning that goes into it. And I'm watching how you guys are launching Fourth, and I'm like, these guys have figured some interesting things out. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff happening here that I'm not sure everybody fully appreciates. I'm like, that's really interesting. So I want to dive into all that. Like, I'm super passionate. My business side's passionate. My gamer side's passionate. But let me ask you this first, Matt. Like, with Fourth, clearly you guys were like, what if we just kind of thought about blowing it all up? Like, what would happen? Like, what were some of your goals in Fourth? Like, what sort of got you to that point where, like, we want to think a little differently, we want to put some energy back? How did that thought process start?
Well, I mean, it definitely is. Fourth Edition has probably been the biggest challenge that we ever took on. And part of the reason is that it's with Warmachine, it's a product line that's been around for quite a while, 3 generations, which generation nowadays, it can mean, 6 years like it did for us, or it can mean 2 years, for other games, right? They might go through editions much faster. So the number of editions isn't as important as I think the fact that we're 20 years old with Warmachine this year. So that's a long time.
Wow, that is a long time.
And we've definitely learned a lot along the way. I know that there's hardly any other companies out there that have ever made mistakes with products. But we have. And as much as I would like to say that we've got an untarnished record, it's not possible to go that long and, just hit home runs every single time. And so with Third Edition, even though when we launched that product, we had more time and more resources and more people involved and more of everything, than we'd ever had previously when Third Edition launched, and it had an incredible launch. But there were some things that were, I think, short-sighted in our planning, more in the way that we understood the community and the audience, what people wanted out of the product. And then once we did stumble a little bit, we weren't fast enough to react. And I think that had sort of a long-term effects on the health of the community and the interest and people's confidence in what we were doing. There was never any lack of effort on our side to try and make everything work and make it right. But sometimes, when you hit a speed bump and too many folks fall out of the back of the truck, and
right, it gets hard to correct.
You just turn around and pick them back up. So a new edition is a new opportunity for us to sort of apply those lessons, from Third Edition, but all the way back to the beginning, and really try and reshape the game, and more than the game, but the experience with it, for what I think is a very different audience than we had when we first started. And that's not to say that the people are necessarily different. We have people that have been playing with us, playing Warmachine since first edition for 20 years, right? And then we've got players that have come in the last year. But even now, I know that I'm not the same guy I was 20 years ago. I don't like to play the games the same way that I like to play them 20 years ago. And I think that we've seen growth and evolution in the people that we started with, and just the game audience at large these days. And you have to keep evolving with the times. And so that has informed a lot of our approach to fourth edition. Everything from the way we produce the game to the way we publish the rules and content around it, to the types of content that we're putting into it, and just everything about our approach. So, I'm sure we'll dive into each of those subjects, but I would say, more than anything, fourth edition is the most thought out version of Warmachine that we've ever done. And when we started 20 years ago, it was fun and novel. We hadn't done anything like it, and everything was new. And we made something that we thought, that we loved and we hoped that other people would love. And then with the second edition, I think we were, we're 5 years into it, and we're like, what the hell do we do? Because we didn't ever really have a plan. And how do we keep this going? Right? Like how do we, make sure that Warmachine isn't just sort of a one-off, but this is, we feel like there's a lot more that we want to do with it. And, clearly it has momentum, and there's more that people want from it. So what do we do next? And so the second edition, Mark II, is really almost it was just, how do we one up that thing that we did before? What's the next thing we can do? How do we keep impressing, our players? And third edition came around, and I think that there was a point at which we were kind of like, we got this, and that's when you hit the speed bump. So
I think overconfidence always gets you.
Yeah.
But I think one thing I'll say, Matt, and I know you you kind of hinted at it, was sort of the passion for the game, and it's been interesting to Raef and I. When we saw you guys were coming out with fourth, we're like, well, we got to break our models out again. We got to play it, and we were playing Warmachine on off. And Raef and I always have a joke. We always bet each other how many games of Warmachine we'll play each year. So we've never left the family, but it's just, is it the first game we grab off the shelf? And when fourth came out, so we played it a couple times, and we're like, ooh, there's something here.
Mm-hmm.
And then what surprised me was something you hinted at, Matt, which was when we started talking about it on the show, we've had the most reaction and most engagement in a long time to a game. I think you've got a group of people out there, a large fan base who is hungry for Warmachine to do some of the things you guys are doing. And everybody's excited and interested to hear about it. And there's still a lot of passion out there. So I think this is one of the reasons Raef and I get excited. And I think our listeners are getting excited. And I'm sure there's tons of gamers out there that are excited. So, I can't wait to dive into more about some of the details you just kind of hinted at.
I think, I'm thinking back to when you launched Prime, like Russ and I and other gamers listening to this. And even if they're new to the hobby, we're old enough to remember, there was only GW in our little sphere. I know there's other games for other people, but when Prime came along, we're like, ooh, this is different. Like something's different's happening here. And it's being run by like a person named Matt Wilson, and he's an artist, and he's got this game in his mind, and he created this whole universe for us. And that was just super fun. And it reminds me of that again, I'm like, oh, okay. There's, instead of just second edition with some tweaks and third with some tweaks, like it reminds me of like Prime or something. Like there's something new happening, which is exciting.
I mean, we're definitely trying to make it, to make it feel new, right? Without also abandoning what it was. And I think that, when you get down into the mechanics of the game, it's still Warmachine, right? It's still feels like Warmachine. Maybe we treat, the movement of units different, or we've added customization or something like that. But it's like at its core, what makes Warmachine has never wavered from edition to edition. We didn't throw out the dice mechanic and, revamp something just for the sake of calling it a new edition. We've always treated edition changes as an opportunity to evolve and, fine tune the game and make it better, file off those friction points that you might discover, after 3 or 4 years of playing an edition. But at the same time, we needed to make Mark IV a great new entry point. So whether you are somebody who is a 20-year-old veteran of the game, or you're brand new, we wanted you to be able to step into Mark IV and not feel lost. And that was a big part of our lesson with Mark III. With Mark III, it wasn't the stumbling blocks weren't rules related necessarily. There was some balance issues and things like that, but those all got addressed over time. It was more of it was almost more existential, right? About what do people want from the game, or what is it that attracts people to a game, and does Warmachine offer that? And one of the biggest problem that we addressed in Mark IV, and we're still sort of navigating our way through it, is that Warmachine is a massive game. The world is huge, but the game is almost, it's just as huge. There's thousands of different models in the back catalog, right? Mm-hmm. And it can be an extremely daunting, intimidating experience for somebody to step into for the first time. And it can also be daunting and intimidating for people who have played it for a long time, but maybe aren't hyper focused on knowing every single little detail so that they can stay competitive. And that's sort of what we've tried to move away from in Mark IV, is making it an experience that is more accessible to somebody who is brand new or plays casually, but also still is just as rewarding to somebody who, wants to be immersed in it all the time. And part of that is thinning out the catalog, which is, I know that it sounds weird because we are releasing new armies at the same time that we're, rotating older models out of the prime arena. We have to make new stuff, right? Like, we have to constantly make new product in order for the business to exist. And I think sometimes people sort of forget that. And I see the response from people like, where they feel like we're sort of talking out of both sides of our mouth, saying, well, you're making models obsolete, but at the same time you're releasing new stuff. Why do you have to make new stuff? And it's like, well, right, we have to, right? We have to, and we have to make that space, right, in order to, it's like forestry, right? Where you got to clear trees in order to make room for new trees to grow, right? And otherwise your forest dies, right? It gets overcrowded and stifled and dies. And I think that is a metaphor that I just stumbled on this moment. So I hope it holds up. But that's
I wanted to ask you. I think that's a great analogy, Matt. And I've seen, like, I think that it helps me understand, and I like it, the changing from factions to essentially army lists, and those army lists have much a more still very interesting and very exciting to look at, but it's a lot less intimidating, right? It's 3 warcasters in an army list instead of maybe 10 or 20 or whatever it is, under Mark III. And so it's all of a sudden, whoa, I have 3 guys to choose from. That's a lot. I feel like I have a lot of choice, but it's still only 3 as opposed to a lot. And Raef and I've talked about this. You did definitely manage to keep it feeling like Warmachine, right? Like it still feels like Warmachine to us. And so let me ask you sort of a double-ended question, which is, as you guys are thinking through these changes, I can only imagine what it was like in that room to try to figure out, okay, what's the core of Warmachine? What are things we can cut? What was the hardest change for you guys to kind of fail through? And then what's your proudest change? Like it's kind of a double-edged side. What are you really happy with? And what was like the hardest decision to make? Like, can we really get rid of facing or whatever it was? Like, what was the hardest choice there on that one?
I mean, on the sort of individual rules sides, there's things that, we went back and forth on. Something like, facing was an easy one because it was like, I think, to step back, when we originally made Warmachine, and I think this is sort of a thing, for maybe first time game designers, right? Is like, you're trying to create all these mechanics that sort of simulate this experience of combat, and you're trying to make it as visceral as possible. At least that's, that was our approach. It was like, I think something that we are kind of known for is we've really tried to put a lot of effort into creating rules that sort of reflect that idea of what you're doing in the game. And, so that it makes the experience more immersive. But over time, we conceded certain things because it made the game experience better, even though it got further away from a simulation. And our new movement rules are that, and those can be very like for people who have played Warmachine for a long time, where you moved your models one by one, measuring each one of them, measuring each charge vector, right? Like, and then all of a sudden now we move to this movement where you move one model and then you place everything else around it, and you're like, well, my guys just like move through a wall, or
right.
or like they're teleporting, and yeah, but no, right? Like
right.
That's the abstraction that makes it a faster, better, more flexible game, and not this rigid simulation that, while some people do enjoy going through those sort of like more difficult trigonometry exercises of plotting out their attack vectors, it doesn't make a great game experience for more people, right? And so that's really where we've tried to, with the game rules. I think that the movement is still going to be one of those things that is contentious, but since we released the beta rules back in, right before Gen Con last year, and there were some people who were great with it right away, and other people were like, oh, I can't stand these. Every single day, we see more people, posting online or things like that about like, oh, I didn't like the movement rules, but I've come around to it and now I love them. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I totally get that. So I would say that was, to answer your question, right, that was kind of column A and column B, right? That was one of the hardest things for us to change about the game, because it also has a lot of interconnectivity in the game rules that it's not, we didn't just change how you move a unit. Like, there's ramifications throughout the game that, and I'll be honest, we're still sorting those out, right? Like, we've got an update that's going to come out in the next week or two that will clarify some things that have caused a little bit of confusion around that. And it's in that, for us, that's part of the process. Is game design is evolutionary, not absolute, rare. And the one of the best things about the Mark IV is, because it is 100% digitally published, we have the ability to make those clarifications, adjust language a little bit to help people along the way. The same way that an online video game can hot fix issues in their code, right? We have that same sort of ability now to do that and not make your book or your cards or something obsolete.
Was that a tough decision, Matt? Because I love that. So I've always thought Privateer was ahead of the curve on War Room. Like, that whole model was interesting, but even back then you still had decks of cards, right? So it was still the option for people to play. And now you're just like, no, we're all in. Like, the books, the fluff, the rules, like the rule book, the scenarios, like, everything is digital. Everything's in that one place. It's in the app. And it is what it is. It must be liberating, but also, was it challenging to go that route and kind of really think, was there any nervousness about like, we're going to go 100% digital, or did War Room give you confidence? Do you guys kind of know, Our players are already living in War Room pretty much, even though we have the cards, and we're feeling pretty good about this option.
Well, we knew the vast majority of our players did use War Room when they played, so we did have that level of confidence. But also, I think that more than anything, the experiencing the limitations of print over the previous 6 years, is what gave me the confidence to know. And I know not everybody was with me as we moved into this, and I think our team is still getting used to the idea of that we're no longer under those limitations. One of the biggest things there was, as we made this determination and getting into War Room and starting to develop the Warmachine app, as we started to develop it and realizing, for better or for worse, and I'm sure it's for better, but there is a dark side to it, is we don't have a space limitation that cards give you anymore. Mm-hmm. And that was always something that we kind of, wrestled with since the beginning, because as we wanted to do more interesting and complex things on cards, we still had a finite amount of space that we could work within. And then at some point we decided, well, what if we just use 2 cards? And then all of a sudden warcasters have, additional cards to make up their, all their rules and everything. And, or the other end of the spectrum is, why don't we compress it down to 3-point type, right?
right.
Yeah.
No one will have a problem reading that, right? And that's, so those limitations can sometimes be good things if you are able to work within them, right? Because they'll keep you from doing things like overriding rules that became too lengthy or too complex. So now we don't have that, right? Because we can make paragraphs as long as we want, and the cards don't constrain the space anymore. And I wouldn't say that has allowed us to run away with the rules, because we're still we're still trying to make things easier and simpler. But at the same time, working in that digital space, we were able to nest all of the rules on a card. So it's not like you open up a card and what you see is a giant card. You have, little tabs that one second. Sorry, I have to check this one out.
Microwave's done. What are you eating, Matt? Any good thing good for dinner?
I don't even know what it is. I just hung the phone up. So now with the cards, though, as I was saying, you've got these, you've got the tabs. So the information's there at your fingertips, but it's not in your way. So you don't have to comb through paragraphs of rules. You just click on the rule with the name that you want, and it opens up and it's right there, or you go to mark damage and you click the damage tab and bam, you can enter in your damage. So
right there. Well, you've also made the user experience better in general, because Raef and I just noticed the other day the new question mark option, which lets you see the definition of all the icons in a section of the card too, which now makes it better than a card experience, right? Because one of the things you guys did in the past was come up with icons to save card space, but now I got to go look the icons up, especially as back to accessibility and easy to use. And now I can just click it. Not only does it show me what the slam icon means slam, but now I got to link right to the slam rules that just expand right out. It's not even really a tap. So I'd say that's one of the things. To me, the new app is peppier, a little faster. So if folks out there tried War Room and haven't tried the Warmachine app, it's a whole new app. And you can tell it was written from the ground up with a lot of interesting thinking in mind, particularly around performance and ease of use. And it definitely achieved a lot of those things.
And I like too, where it does seem like you took a lot of care and attention for the players, where you could say, hey guys, we're gonna create some legacy abilities for you, and they're gonna have new stats. So all your old armies, or not all, but some of the choices we pre-select in the app to run the legacy models. And that I do think that's that nod for those people that have been with you for 20 years. And yet it's also fun to then think, ooh, and then what are the new models that I can purchase and play with and have fun with? So I for one, again, I'm biased because I'm a big Privateer Press fan. So I realize I'm biased to those listeners out there, but I felt that love as a gamer, where you said, hey guys, we're going to give you this opportunity, and they're new. they're new rules to the old
Mhm.
models, which is fun. And then there's these new models that we can also enjoy to help support the company and have the company grow too. So I think that was done brilliantly personally.
Thank you. We haven't spared any effort on the legacy models. In fact, I mean, if you look at the amount of hours that have gone into the new releases versus the conversions of the back catalog to the new Mark IV rules, the legacy effort is tenfold what the new effort is.
I think it shows. Like, I know that these aren't just throwaway rules or throwaway catch-up mechanics, not at all, to anybody listening who hasn't come back.
No,
Yeah.
we've put all the same effort, because I mean, at the end of the day, we don't want anything to feel like it was not given the time of day. And I mean, and I think now we have a little bit of proof, right? We have in the competitive events at Adepticon this past weekend, we had legacy models in the finals. So they're not, they haven't been shortchanged.
Let me ask you about that, Matt, since Raef jumped there and there's been some, I don't know, Raef and I were talking about this. So in our last episode about Warmachine, we ended up spending like most of the time debating amongst ourselves, like what your guys' go-to-market strategy on this is and what the difference is. So for listeners out there who might be confused like us, because I think one of the things that is awesome is that the app, the Warmachine app, shows sort of like, when you go to build an army, there's Prime and then there's Unlimited. And if you click on Prime, there's Mark IV and there's Legacy, right? And then within there's different armies you can choose from. But to your point, what you just mentioned, I think is important for people. I think a lot of people look at Legacy and they assume, well, that's not going to be tournament legal, but only the Mark IV is tournament legal. But so can you walk us through, like, what's the difference between Unlimited, Prime Mark IV, and Prime Legacy? Sure.
Yeah. Now, what is tournament legal at the end of the day depends on the person running the tournament, right?
Sure.
And that's not something that we ever would want to dictate. But what we did for to try and achieve that goal of making sure that Mark IV was accessible to new players and existing players and returning players is we, in an effort not to completely abandon anything that we've created for people, we separated, we created two different play arenas, right? There's the Prime Arena and the Unlimited Arena. And the Prime Arena is all the new content that is Mark IV, right? Everything that is introduced to the game from the point that we launched Mark IV forward in this edition, as well as a curated, limited amount of content from every faction that existed prior to Mark IV. And in general, what that means is every faction has 2 armies that are playable in it. Now, that's not true for everything, because there are certain armies or certain factions that were more contained, like the Grimkin or the Crucible Guard, where we said, they're recent enough and they are also limited enough that 100% of those, of their models are going to be playable in the Prime Arena. But larger factions, whether it was Crix or Signar or these armies factions that have been around for 20 years, right, and had hundreds and hundreds of models, dozens of warcasters or warlocks, we basically created 2 armies within each of those around their dominant themes, and made sure that those armies have lots of options as well. Each one of those armies has multiple warcasters and troops and warjacks or warbeasts or whatever, and so you can, there's lots of space in there to customize your army the way you could before. It's just you can't play everything together, and those armies are independent of each other as well, because that's a big concept of Mark IV is keeping is you don't play a faction anymore, you play an army, right? And that army is somewhat contained. I'm kind of contained, kind of in air quotes, right? Like it's not, it doesn't mean that we will never make new content for it, but we're not going to perpetually expand these armies the way many of the factions were historically for Warmachine, where every year there was new content that came out for.
So does that mean like the Signar Storm Legion, right? So like am I saying the right name? I always get it because it's Storm Legionnaire.
Yes,
The Storm Legion is the new Prime Mark IV Signar force at the moment, right? And it looks like you guys really thought carefully about accessibility, as you mentioned. Like the number of models in there is reasonable. There's still a lot of freaking choices in there because your jacks are. And we talked about in the show before, like how the jacks are customizable, and there's spell racks and all kinds of cool stuff you can do. So there's a lot of customization in there, not amongst all the other things you can pick. But it also means everything else for Signar would either be in. And it also you're kind of controlling it like so. There's the base box for that. So it sounds like you guys are also thinking about the SKUs, right? Like how much shelf space is going to take up at a store. So you got the base box, and then there's like one small army expansion box for that, and then there's a couple of single boxes. And then if someone wanted more different Signar stuff, that would probably someday come out as a different Signar net new army, right? You wouldn't probably blow out the Storm Legion more. Is that what you're saying?
So let me go into that a little deeper too, because one thing that I know can be confusing, especially for anybody stepping into this for the first time, and especially if they have experience with Warmachine, is there are some factions that exist both as in Legacy and in Mark IV, right? But those armies are not compatible. So the Storm Legion is not compatible with the first army, right? The first army being a legacy army, and Storm Legion being the new Mark IV. Those armies, while they exist under the same umbrella as Signar, they don't have any crossover. And there's a hard line between Mark IV models and legacy models where they can't exist in the same army, except for the places that we're going to break those rules in the future, which will happen, but that's down the road.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the way we will expand things in the future in Mark IV, let's take the Storm Legion, for example. They are relatively.
You would have did that, Raef? I'm talking about my army.
I do.
Yeah, let's take the Storm Legion as an example. Let's not talk about Khador. No one cares about them.
It's a good one because there's a lot that people already know about it, right? So the Storm Legion is relatively contained, and it'll have 6 or 7 SKUs, and SKU count is something that we were very, very cognizant of, because one of the challenges over the past 6 or 8 years, as our industry overall has become more and more impacted with product, it is incredibly difficult for retailers and distributors to stock games with lots of SKUs. Like,
right.
There was a day where you could walk into a store and it would be 20 feet of Warmachine Accords, blisters, hundreds, maybe thousands, right, on the walls. Yeah. If the store was full service, and that it doesn't exist anymore. No one can do it, right? And so what we wanted to do was really reduce that footprint that the product has, on an army to army basis, so that retailers could decide, if they are just going to carry the starters so that they can bring new people into the game. If they want to be full service, right, and make sure that they have everything available for an army at any time, then that means they're carrying a starter, an expansion box, one a la carte warcaster, and a solo, and a couple of warjacks, right? Like that's everything that gives you all of your options for that army. Now, within that, right, and not to make that sound too limited, right, you still have 3 warcasters, and you've got lots of units and solos, and you can create all kinds of different configurations for your army out of those options. But that's your menu. Now, in sometime next year, we'll release the next Signar army, right? And right now, for the sake of example, we'll just call them the Gravediggers. And
we could call them the Gun Mages, Raef. I mean, not to lead you on, but the Gun Mages were the first models they ever painted, and it would be really cool if there are King Gun Mages back in the game. I'm not trying to influence you in any way.
Well, hang on, because let me get to the Gun Mages, because that's part of that's part of the spiel here, right? So
okay, good. Go continue then, please.
we've got the grave diggers, this trencher army, right?
Yeah.
That have a similar scope of of content as the Storm Legion does. But the Storm Legion and the grave diggers, they cannot work together, right? We can't combine them in the same army, the same force, even though they're both Signar armies, right? But we have another configuration of models called cadres. And a cadre is a smaller group of themed models like gun mages, right? Where we don't have whole armies of gun mages running around, but we've got small elite units. And so a cadre will be maybe, let's say, 6 to 10 models total. Mm-hmm. And that's where your gun mages come in. And the cadres within a faction can be used in a force with any army in that faction.
Ooh, they're like faction specific mercs sort of thing.
Yeah, right. So your gun mages can work with the Storm Legion, or they can work with the Gravediggers, and so every faction in that has new content in Mark IV will have multiple armies and multiple cadres, as well as some other models that can basically be used between armies, colossals and battle engines, for instance, right? Those are big purchases when it comes to the models, and we want to make sure that you get the most mileage out of them. And so those models will also be usable between armies under the same faction.
That's awesome.
And it also gives you a bridge, right? So that when you're like, I'm a Signar player and I love my Storm Legion, but I also like my grunts over here with the trenchers, right? Like, you've got a bridge, you've got some models that are going to work, both ways for you. And what that does is it multiplies the options that you have for those armies, but also it still keeps the armies relatively contained, which is a very good thing for us as game designers, right? To be able to continue to develop new and interesting things that keep your armies fresh without having to sort of like water it down or sterilize it, because now this thing has to be compatible with 12 warcasters, right? Like those kinds of things. When you have,
it must help with game balance, right? That you kind of know what a Storm Legion looks like most of the time, as opposed to when you introduce a model into a pool where it has the ability to interact with everything else in this menu, right? The size of that menu will have a lot to do with what you can actually do with a new model. And I'm really mincing my words there, but saying the bigger the pool is, the harder it is to create new and interesting things because of those, all the different ways that it multiplies those interactions. Whereas keeping things more focused lets us, I think, have a lot more fun with what we can offer players in those armies. And then as well, it also lets us, I think, touch on a lot more different themes throughout the setting that we might not get to if we have to just keep focusing on. It also gives a really cool thematic sort of. It's interesting to even just the name, like the Signar Legacy Army is like the first army, something. Oh, what? That's like, it's like the big red one. Like that's kind of cool, So you start you think about the fluff and the background of those sorts of things. It just gets your creative juices flowing as a player.
I had a question on fluff too, Matt. How does somebody catch up, so to speak, if they've been away for a while or they're new on what the old storyline or older storylines were to the current?
You don't. And that's by design, right?
Okay.
So with Mark IV, we went into it we put a big time jump in between sort of where we left off the storyline in the Mark III era and where we take up this new storyline in Mark IV.
Oh, so neat.
If you get into the game now and you start reading the lore or any of the fiction, you don't have to know anything that existed before to sort of understand the state of the world, to know who the characters are. We wanted it to be a brand new starting point. And so the whole storyline sort of is, it really kicks off with the new Orgoth invasion. Now, of course, it's going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, because who are the Orgoth? They are these guys from 800 years ago that conquered the Iron Kingdoms, and that's all in the history of the setting. But that stuff we catch you up on really fast, right? Like, you're going to understand who the Orgoth are very quickly, why that's significant that they've returned to the Iron Kingdoms. But like all the Warcasters, it's an all new pantheon of characters. We have a few returning characters. There's a couple of mercs that are longtime stars of the setting, Eris and Alexia, and we did want to have feel like we have those ties, but they're not drivers necessarily of the storyline, and so I don't think somebody coming into the setting for the first time isn't going to encounter them and suddenly feel lost, like they don't know who these characters are. And
I think that's really helpful. Because I know, like Russ was saying, like his favorite caster striker is like dead now, and I'm like, wait, when did that?
Well, he was dead at the end of Mark 3, though.
Okay, so I just missed that.
A decision that I have issues with, Matt. I'm not gonna lie, but these things happen.
We can unpack that, another time. But that's so.
Somebody
coming in, they don't have to feel like they have to catch up. So that's just good to know.
Right.
Yeah, and then another thing, and this is something that over. Since the beginning of Warmachine, the storyline's always been very important to us. We love telling the story of the setting of the characters, and we have aggressively moved that storyline forward. Every year, with every new publication, and then through myriad other novels and short fiction in magazines and published online and all over the place. And we often get requests to like, hey, collect this into a giant omnibus. And we've actually tried to do it twice, where we literally made it a huge project to try and like bring all this stuff
together
into one volume or multiple volumes that could be, read through cohesively. And it didn't work. Like, we literally would get into the project and say, we just can't make this work in a way that's ever going to be satisfying for anybody. Mm-hmm. And so that was a big part of the reason for us wanting this new starting point, Mark 4. So now you go to the app, right? And you open the library and you go to the fiction, right? And there's our first storyline. It's a serialized fiction. Every month there's a new installment of it. And, and then all of the lore documents are there for.
It's great. I love watching that come out. Like because I jumped in the app almost as soon as you guys launched it, and it was fun to just see the high level lore, but then you had the faction specific stuff, which was fun.
That is fun.
And so it's clear. And one thing, just kind of come back to the list really quick, because I think it's all tied together a little bit. So when we were talking about, you go into the app for a minute, and so you're going to build a list, and you can choose Prime Legacy or Prime Mark 4. The only models you're ever going to see in there are models that either, if it's the Mark 4, it's the new stuff. So it's everything that's been basically produced since 2022 going forward, I guess, is a good way to say it. And then the legacy stuff is anything that is balanced from the older models, but is still alive. So you would never see Stryker in Legacy because he's dead, but you might see Cray in Legacy, which you do because he's still around. But then you also have this other playability, which is unlimited. And it's a little confusing now for maybe a new player to go in, because everything that's unlimited is also in Legacy and Mark 4. But eventually, my understanding, right, is that everything that was ever produced would be in Legacy. So if I wanted to play an old school game with Raef, Unlimited. If I wanted to play an old school game with Vlad versus Stryker, for example, I could play Unlimited, right? Is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah, absolutely. That's by the end of this year, and probably well before it, we will have converted every Legacy model will have rules in the Unlimited arena. So if you want to wade into that arena where, to really have a full knowledge of it, you need to understand thousands of models.
Right.
They will all have their rules, right? So yeah, you can play that old school game. It won't be the most common way to play, right? Because anybody who is running a competitive format or anything and is interested in maintaining, a healthy, growing community is going to realize that having a more limited arena is a healthier thing for that sort of competition play.
I think that's right. It makes a lot of sense. I just think I really appreciate you guys are going through all the time to update the rules so I can play those old models. And you've basically created Warmachine historicals because now, and because I think you guys pretty much said pretty clearly too, correct me if I'm wrong, like Unlimited, by the way, may not be the most balanced experience, right? We're not really too concerned about making sure it's balanced because one of the reasons by limiting some of this stuff, it lets us be more balanced. So just word of caution, it's probably not super balanced, but if you want to have a nice fun time, have a few nice drinks and relive the old days, you can certainly do that.
Yeah.
It won't be as buttoned up as the Prime Arena, right? Everything is getting play tested, and we're certainly doing our best as we do these conversions. But it is not possible, practical. And I want to say possible again to
no, but I appreciate you guys are putting the time in because I really do it. Oh, so Matt, I know we're getting close on time, and I want to give Raef another question, but I did want to ask you this. So you guys are innovating in a couple of really interesting ways. I think it's really worth noting. One, of course, is going fully digital. I can't think of another miniature game that's fully digital right now. At least not a mainstream one. I'm sure there's some small ones somewhere, but so that's really fascinating, especially in this day and age when there's miniature games on every corner. You can't. And that's one of the reasons the SKU limiting is pretty smart, because part of the problem is stores have so many to carry now. It's just not, you don't see the GW wall that big either. You just can't fill it out. Yeah. But the other place you guys are innovating, which is really interesting, is you've moved 100, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding, you moved 100% to 3D printing now for your production of your models. Tell me about that whole thinking process, and what do you think that enables you guys to do?
Yeah, that's almost 100%, but definitely by the end of this year, it will definitely be.
So no more spin casting, no more giant, super expensive plastic molds. This is like everything's just a fancy 3D printer in Matt's basement.
Yeah, I wish it was in my basement. We have a big expensive space that we're paying for every month, but yeah, it is all about the 3D production now. And so the way we got there was, it's so 2022 to talk about the pandemic anymore, right? But that's really, a big part of going through that, and watching the world change, everything from the supply chain disruptions or overseas production to the rising cost in materials, and I've, even before the pandemic, this was an issue for us. But when we got into producing metal models back in 2003, we used to pay $3.25 a pound for metal. And over, a decade or so, by the time we got to about 2013, 2015, we were paying over $13 a pound for it.
Wow.
And that's a huge, increase to our cost of goods, our materials costs. And it's, I'm not sure where it was at this point, but I know it went up even further during the sort of pandemic woes. Now at the same time, we've seen labor go up, double, and beyond, and we want to try and stay as competitive there as we can as well. So the rising costs of everything were a huge factor in us trying to figure out where do we go next. And there aren't too many options when it comes to making miniatures, but the three that we've used over historically have been the cast metal, the cast resin, and then overseas production. And there's multiple types of plastics productions, and we've experienced all of them. But those are sort of your options. And then 3D printing came along, and we'd been watching it for years. We've been using it for years in our production process as
for mock-ups and stuff, right?
Well, for making our masters, right? Yeah, so right. We would, as we moved from traditional sculpting into digital sculpting, and everything, had to be printed out so that we could create a physical mold from it. We've I don't know how many years, but for quite a while, right? We've made, all of the original masters, right? What would have been the original sculpts back when they were done traditionally by hand have been 3D printed, and we make the molds from those. So we had experience there, but, and we've been watching, carefully over the years at how the technology was changing and becoming more accessible and becoming more possible to produce at scale, at the kind of commercial volume that we would need to. And there's trade-offs. Like it's not a silver bullet when it comes to production, because there's certain things that it can do better and certain things that it doesn't do as well. When it comes down to speed and labor costs, metal production is still by far the fastest, right? Like we can crank metal pieces out super fast, but there are other expenses like the molds that have to be made, and then of course the unpredictability or the volatility rather of the materials costs that we have to deal with. Resin, poured resin, right, is a lot more stable when it comes to the materials cost, and the material itself isn't particularly it's far less expensive than metal, which is why we've years ago when we started making the really big pieces in resin, it was because we could make those things and still keep them relatively affordable, even though the volume of material was pretty significant. But on the labor side, it's incredibly slow. It's it takes a long time to set those up and pour each one. The molds don't last very long; they burn out really fast. So we're constantly remaking molds, which are expensive. And so we sort of balanced our costs and effort and labor and everything between metal and resin over the past many years. But then we got to this point during the pandemic where we said metal is just no longer feasible. It's not something that is sustainable because the cost, we can't predict where it's going to go. And by, every indicator, it was just going to keep going up. If not, and there's also the possibility that it might just one day not even be there. Like you might not be able to easily because somebody else is eating it all up, And what people don't know is like tin all comes from one mine, right? Like it's not, there's lots of places that this stuff comes from. Back when we started, there was a mine in Brazil and there was a mine in China, I think, like two places. And I'm probably not exactly right about those two places, but it was something like that. Right. And then the one in Brazil closed, and that's part of what caused the costs to start rising, after several years that we were in this. And it was like, we're at the mercy of one place that digs this stuff out of the ground.
Right.
Interesting.
And, eventually it gets to the material that we're making. So we needed a better solution long-term. And the technology for 3D printing was becoming more accessible. The materials are becoming more resilient. And the one thing that we can count on 100% is that it's going to get better every year, right?
Yeah.
This technology, we've been watching it, now for years. Every 6 to 12 months is like a generational
huge leap, right?
In the tech. And so the machines that we're using right now, we know that as they burn out, in the next year or two, we're going to be replacing them with better machines that are going to provide better quality,
faster, higher resolution. Matt, does it help you? Does it also make it easier for you guys to distribute models out of new locations? Is it easier to set up a manufacturing facility that basically cranks out 3D printed stuff somewhere, like in, let's say, Europe or someplace, or does that's
part of the long-term strategy for this, is that yes, it will allow us to localize production in different regions so that we can not have to ship stuff around the world, because that is a big
shipping costs are up for everybody. So anything you can do to lower shipping costs to the users.
So and that's absolutely the long-term goal. That is very easy to state as a long-term goal.
Right. There's a lot between here and there.
It's a lot harder to put that plan into action, because at the end of the day, right, you can have a 3D printer farm delivered tomorrow, but you got to have the people to run it. And this is where people don't understand 3D printing, because everybody who has ever been near a 3D printer is an expert about 3D.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of listeners now going, I could run that for Matt in my basement.
They all know exactly how it works, and we get lots of advice on a daily basis, which is great. But but the reality with 3D printing production is it's not a push button process. You don't just like load your file on and bam, out comes, perfect models. It is still an incredibly labor intensive process because it's just that instead of that labor being on the front end, as it was when we were doing traditional cast miniatures, where it's you go through, you make your masters, and then you make master molds, and then you make production masters, and you make production molds, and then somebody spins all those, and eventually you have piles of miniatures piling up, and after that they just kind of get packed into the packaging. But with 3D printing, it's kind of in reverse. You do plug your file into the printer and away it goes. And then a few hours later, you come back and you take your models off the plate, and then you clean the printer. And then the models go through an extensive rinsing and washing and post-production curing process that is multiple steps, actually more steps in the overall like sequence of, of beginning to end for a product than anything that we've done before. But there are certain advantages to, well, if we want to scale up, it's just a matter of we can add more printers. But that does mean that we may need more hands to take those off. So it's for me, it's been a pretty fascinating experience to try to learn all of this and to understand the, where the human side of it is and where the automated side of it is, and how those things have to work together. But it's not as simple as what people think. Have
you found it all? I'm curious, because I blame you for this. I ended up buying the Storm Legion box, so that's on you. And it's wonderful. The models look fantastic, and I've been having a fun time taking them out. And I noticed there's much less assembly than I sort of expected. Have you found, has there been any pleasant surprises? I don't want to predict that this is easier than before. It sounds like a lot of it's still challenging, just different challenges. But have you been pleasantly surprised at all with 3D printing? Is it giving you more options for different dynamic poses, more or less detail? Like, what is your feeling going forward? Like, we can do some things now that maybe we couldn't do before from just a model aesthetics. We can do things with the 3D printing that you can literally only do with additive manufacturing, right? With 3D printing. Let's see, like one of my favorite examples is the Sea Raiders Tyrant, which I don't know if you've seen the model, if you're familiar with it, but it's the heavy warjack for the Sea Raiders, and it has these big like blades that come up over its shoulders and lots of like spiky bits. And if you took that body, the Orgoth Tyrant body piece, which we now make as one piece, like that's the body, the legs, everything except for the head and the arms that you magnetize for the customization, that whole body piece is produced as one piece. But just the torso piece, which was a piece that we manufactured early on, that would have been 7 individual pieces in traditional manufacturing. It probably would have been more if it was made in like hard plastic, right? You would have a whole sprue, right? of pieces to have to assemble there. And we're able to do that in one piece. So absolutely from the assembly side of it, like if you're somebody who loves the assembly of miniatures, and I have yet to meet that person, but
I was going to say, no, that's not me.
Love that, right? then we're going the wrong way for you, right? Because what we're doing with the 3D printing is more and more we're finding ways to be able to reduce the part count to get super dynamic poses or the incredible pass-throughs. Now if you look at the detail in the models, there's pass-throughs where things that would have had to be filled in before in traditional casting, or where we would have like pushed, like say an accessory like a canteen or a grenade or something that might sit on somebody's torso. We'd push it in because you have to watch out for those little undercuts, right? So everything
you can't create those areas where the molds are going to get stuck in between. That doesn't, you don't have that problem with 3D printing anymore. There's a whole other set of problems that we have to deal with.
With a different problem.
Right. But with that stuff, we can do these things. You look in the where different troopers or there's certain characters in the Storm Legion box, right? The ones that don't have their helmets on. You look at Ansem Wolf is a great example. Look at where his head sits inside of his collar, right?
Yeah.
That's impossible to do in any other.
Yeah, I noticed that on some of the bigger guys. They're huge. The storm throwers and stuff that just look awesome. You're right. Yeah. It's like the collars come up past their helmet edges, which you normally have to glue the helmet in. It's all one piece. It's crazy. It's awesome.
Yeah, the storm throwers, the Tempests guys.
Yeah.
They're three pieces: the two arms and the body.
Right. That was crazy.
All in one piece. You can't even.
That blew me away.
And then, as you saw, the Warcaster Debaro is one piece, right?
Yep.
Shield, lance, everything, all one piece. And if you see the Winter Korps starter box, every single model in that box is one piece.
Raef's Winter Korps is supposedly heading to his house as we speak.
It's winging its way from Seattle.
So, Matt, I want to be cognizant of time. I know you're taking time out of your busy day. We really appreciate it. But thank you, Matt, so much for joining us today and spending time with us. And if people want to learn more about everything you guys are doing, it's over at privateerprescott.com, right?
Yeah. Yep. Always awesome. Well, thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Achievement unlocked. You've made it to the end of another D6 Generation episode, the podcast whose humor has universally been acclaimed as not too horrible. Please let us know what you thought of the show by emailing us at info@the d6generation.com. If for some inexplicable reason you actually enjoyed this show, you can help others find out about it by leaving positive reviews on iTunes. Thanks for listening and happy gaming.